It's a Monday morning when James Thompson's world crumbles into 1,000 pieces. CEO of a $3.2 billion multinational, he's about to enter the most important meeting of his career when an 8-year-old girl in worn clothes and eyes shining with hope blocks his path. "Mummy said you'd come back," she whispers, clutching a faded photograph. But James has never seen her before. He doesn't know who this child is, or why she's looking for him. And when he looks at the photo she offers him, he sees himself embracing a woman he thought he'd forgotten forever. What he'll discover in the next few minutes will change not only his life, but both their destinies. The shard rose into London's grey sky, like a giant of glass and steel, reflecting the ambitions and dreams of thousands of people who passed through its doors each day. On the 42nd floor, James Thompson adjusted his Hermes tie in front of the enormous window of his office, observing the city that spread beneath his feet like an empire to be conquered. At 45, James was the embodiment of modern success. CEO of Thompson Industries, a multinational he'd transformed from a small family business into a $3.2 billion colossus. His name appeared regularly on the covers of Forbes and Fortune. Divorced for 5 years, childless, he'd devoted every moment of his existence to building an empire that had made him one of Britain's richest and most powerful men. This November morning, he had a crucial appointment with Japanese investors that could be worth over £500 million. He'd prepared every detail for weeks, studied every figure, analyzed every possible objection. It was the kind of deal that defines a career, that transforms success into legend. As he strode purposefully towards the boardroom, his assistants followed like a disciplined army, updating him on last-minute details. The click of his English leather shoes echoed on the polished marble, whilst his cold, calculating gaze mentally reviewed the key points of his presentation. It was precisely as he crossed the main lobby that he saw her. An 8-year-old girl with disheveled brown hair and clothes that had seen better days sat in one of the leather armchairs in reception. Her large dark eyes followed him with an intensity that struck him like an unexpected blow. When their gazes met, the girl slowly stood up, clutching something tightly in her hands. James slowed his pace, confused. How was it possible for a child to have reached this floor without authorization? Where were the security systems? But before he could ask any questions, the little one approached him with uncertain but determined steps. The girl raised her eyes to him, and in that moment, James saw something that deeply disturbed him. It wasn't fear that shone in those dark eyes, but hope. A pure and desperate hope that seemed to cling to him like a castaway to a life raft. Without saying a word, the girl offered him what she held in her hand, an old and faded photograph with corners damaged by time and hands that had touched it too often. James took it automatically, and what he saw froze him. In the photo was him, but him from 20 years ago. Younger, with fewer lines around his eyes, his hair still completely black. He was embracing a beautiful woman with chestnut hair and eyes that smiled at the camera. Behind them, you could see the sea, perhaps the Cornwall coast, and both seemed happy in a way that James had forgotten was possible. The world around him seemed to stop. His assistants continued talking, but their voices came muffled, as if from very far away. The girl watched him with those enormous eyes, waiting for a reaction he couldn't give. It was then that the little one opened her mouth and spoke the words that would change everything. Mummy had said he would come back, that she should wait for him, because people who truly love each other always find each other again. James looked again at the photograph, then at the girl, then back at the photograph. Memories began to surface like air bubbles from depths he thought he'd sealed forever. Emma. Emma Clark, the woman he'd loved passionately 20 years ago when he was still a university student full of dreams and without concrete ambitions. But Emma belonged to the past, to a life he'd deliberately abandoned when he'd chosen career over love. He hadn't seen her for 19 years, since that terrible night when he'd told her she had to choose between him and the future he was building. Who was this girl? And why did she have a photo of him and Emma? His assistants began to notice something was wrong. James stood motionless like a statue, holding that photograph and staring at a girl who shouldn't be there. One of them approached to ask if he was all right, but James couldn't answer. The girl, seeing his confusion, did something that completely unsettled him. She took his free hand with her small, cold fingers and smiled at him with a sweetness that broke something inside his chest. In that moment, James Thompson, the man who controlled billions and decided the fate of thousands of people, realized he was facing the most important mystery of his life. And for the first time in 20 years, money, power, and success suddenly seemed insignificant compared to this small hand that squeezed his. James stared at the girl whilst the chaos of the office continued around them. In a hoarse voice, he asked what her name was. She replied simply, Sophie. Sophie Clark. And her mummy was Emma, the woman in the photograph. The name struck James like lightning. Emma Clark. The literature student he'd loved passionately 20 years ago when he was still a student full of dreams. Emma, who read Neruda at sunset and believed love could conquer everything. James knelt down to Sophie's level, ignoring the astonished looks of his employees. In the girl's features, he recognized something familiar. The shape of her eyes, the way she tilted her head, even that small mole near her ear that he'd always had. His heart racing, James asked where Emma was. Sophie lowered her gaze, explaining that her mummy was very ill, in hospital for months. The doctors said difficult words, but she knew she might not come home again. Sophie continued, telling him she lived with Granny. But she was poorly too. Emma had always talked about James, showing her this photograph, saying if anything happened to her, she should find this man. Because he'd truly loved her. Memories exploded in James's mind. Emma laughing, Emma crying when he worked too much, Emma begging him not to change. And then, that terrible night 20 years ago, when he'd had to choose between her and his career. She'd chosen to stay in their university town. He'd chosen to leave. With a trembling voice, James asked Sophie when she was born. She replied proudly, 15th of August, she'd be 9 years old. James did the calculation. August, 9 years ago. Emma had fallen pregnant before their breakup. Sophie wasn't just Emma's daughter. Sophie was his daughter. The realization hit him like a train. For 8 years, he'd had a daughter without knowing it. Emma had raised their child alone, never seeking him out. His assistants kept calling him, reminding him of the crucial appointment. But James realized there were more important things than money. There was his daughter, who needed him, and there was Emma, who might be living her final days. James stood up, holding Sophie's hand, whilst the business world collapsed around him. He turned to Robert and told him firmly to cancel everything. The meeting, the calls, the appointments. Robert protested about the millions at stake, but James stopped him with a gesture. He asked Sophie to take him to her mummy immediately. The girl nodded, her eyes lighting up with joy. As they went down to the garage, James called his driver. Sophie explained that Emma was at St. Thomas's Hospital Oncology Ward. During the journey, Sophie told him about Emma, literature teacher, who read her stories every evening, the sweetest person in the world. But in recent months, she'd become weaker and weaker, until she couldn't get out of bed. James listened with a tight throat, realizing everything he'd missed. 8 years of his daughter's life. 8 years when Emma had struggled alone. Sophie explained that Emma had always spoken of him with love, without resentment, just nostalgia. At the hospital, Sophie guided him through corridors she knew well. James stopped outside the door, terrified. How could he look at Emma after 20 years? But Sophie took his hand and told him Mummy was waiting. Emma was in the hospital bed, connected to machines, thin from chemotherapy. But when she saw James, her eyes lit up with the same light as 20 years ago.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
20 years of separation dissolved. Emma smiled and whispered his name. She told him she knew he would come, that she'd always believed in their love. And looking at Sophie, she added that she'd raised the most beautiful thing they'd ever created together. James approached, taking Emma's fragile hand. He asked forgiveness for everything, for leaving her, for not being there. But Emma shook her head. There was nothing to forgive. Having him there now was everything she'd ever wanted. When Sophie went out to get a drink, Emma turned to James with feverish eyes. She told him the truth. Aggressive pancreatic cancer, 2 months to live, perhaps 3. James felt the world collapse, but Emma didn't want pity. She wanted to talk about Sophie's future. Emma explained she'd raised the child alone, with help from the now ill grandmother. No support beyond her teacher's salary. She'd postponed seeking James out of pride, but now Sophie needed a father. When Sophie returned, she sat between them, happy to finally have her parents together. Emma asked James to tell her about his life, but the words about business success sounded hollow even to him in the face of Emma's courage. Sophie asked the question that changed everything, whether they would now become a real family. Emma explained that James had important commitments, but the girl insisted she just wanted a daddy who loved her. James looked at Sophie and Emma and understood that true wealth was the bonds of love. He took their hands and promised never to leave them alone again, to stay for all of Emma's remaining time, and then care for Sophie. Emma wept with joy. Sophie hugged him tightly. James called Robert to announce indefinite leave for family reasons. Robert protested, but James said he'd found something more important than business. For the first time in 20 years, he fell asleep at peace with himself. The following 2 months were the most precious of James's life. He transferred company management to the vice president, rented a flat near the hospital, and reorganized everything around Emma and Sophie. Every morning he brought special breakfasts and surprises. On Emma's good days, they took walks in the hospital garden. On difficult days, he stayed by the bed, reading her the books she loved. Sophie initially struggled to accept the changes, but James patiently learned to be a father. One evening, the girl asked why Mummy was ill, and if she would get better. James explained honestly that doctors can't always cure everything, but love never dies, and he would never leave her alone. Emma watched James become a father day by day, seeing the man she'd always known he could be. One particularly weak January morning, she asked James to marry her. She wanted Sophie to have married parents and wanted to die with his name. The wedding took place 3 days later in the hospital chapel. Emma could barely stand but radiant, Sophie a proud witness in a pink dress. When the vicar said, "Till death do us part," everyone knew how close those words were to reality. Emma died 5 days later, peacefully, holding James's hand whilst Sophie slept beside her. Her last words were to thank him for coming back and asking him to take care of their beautiful little girl. 6 months after Emma's death, James and Sophie had found a new balance that neither would have thought possible. Their house in central London had become a refuge of warmth and love, filled with Sophie's laughter and the projects they built together for the future. James had decided not to return to Thompson Industries' operational management. He'd kept ownership and a strategic oversight role, but delegated daily management to devote the time his daughter deserved. The decision had surprised the financial world, but James had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in billions of pounds, but in moments shared with people you love. Sophie had gone through a difficult period after Emma's death, but with help from a child psychologist, and especially James's constant love, she was slowly processing her grief. She'd begun calling him Daddy without hesitation, and James was moved every time he heard that word. The girl had also begun telling him her dreams for the future. She wanted to become a doctor, like those who'd cared for Mummy, to help other children experiencing her fear. James listened with pride, recognizing in her Emma's generosity and the determination she'd inherited from him. They'd also started new traditions. Saturday mornings they went to the market together, and Sophie chose ingredients to cook lunch. Sundays they visited Emma's grave, bringing fresh flowers and telling her what they'd done during the week. James had learned that pain doesn't disappear, but can transform into gratitude for the time you managed to share. One evening, whilst helping Sophie with her maths homework, the girl looked up from her exercise book and asked him a question that touched his heart. She asked if he was happy to have her as his daughter, even though it meant not being able to do the important work he'd done before. James put down the pencil and looked Sophie in the eyes, those eyes so similar to his own that shone with the same intelligence as Emma's. He explained that before meeting her, he'd thought he was happy, but really he was just busy. True happiness was what he felt now, every morning when she gave him a good-night kiss, every time they laughed together, every moment he realized he'd become the person he should always have been. Sophie smiled and returned to her homework, satisfied with the answer. But she added something James never forgot, that Mummy was also happy up there in heaven, because she'd always known he would become the best daddy in the world. That night, watching Sophie sleep in her room full of books and drawings, James thought about the miracle that had transformed his life. A brave little girl had crossed London to find him, had risked everything to reunite her family, and had saved not only herself, but him too. He'd lost billions in company value because of his choices, but had gained something priceless: his daughter's unconditional love, and the certainty of becoming the man Emma had always believed he could be. The next day, James and Sophie were having breakfast when the phone rang. It was Robert, informing him that the Japanese investors had returned with an even more advantageous offer, specifically asking to deal with him. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the one that would have made Thompson Industries the global giant James had always dreamed of. James listened in silence, then looked at Sophie spreading jam on her toast whilst humming a song she'd learned at school. He said to politely decline the offer. Robert protested, but James interrupted him, explaining that he already had everything he wanted. When he hung up, Sophie asked who it was. James told her it was someone who wanted him to do an important job, but he'd said no because he already had the most important job in the world, being her daddy. Sophie hugged him tightly and whispered in his ear that she too had the most important job in the world, being his little girl. In that moment, James Thompson realized that the girl in worn clothes he'd met 6 months earlier in the Shard's lobby hadn't just changed his life. She'd saved his soul. And as they left home to take Sophie to school, James looked at the sky and whispered a thank you to Emma, knowing she was smiling and proud of the family they'd managed to build together, even if only for a short time. Love, he'd learned, isn't measured by duration, but by intensity. and what he, Emma, and Sophie had shared would last forever. Did this story of second chances and rediscovered love move you? Did it make you reflect on what's truly important in life? If you too believe it's never too late to make the right decisions, that love can conquer all, and that sometimes children are wiser than adults. Give a like and share this video. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to choose between career and family? Do you think success is worth more than love? Do you believe James made the right decision, leaving everything for his daughter? Subscribe to the channel for more stories celebrating the power of family love, the courage to change your life, and the beauty of second chances. Like, comment, share. Because every story reminds us that true wealth is the people we love, that it's never too late to become the person we should always have been, and that sometimes a small hand can save a lost soul.